Good morning, everybody. I do have an outline that I'm about to follow, but reflecting on last night's panel, the last one, which had the same theme as this one, there was something that was said that I just want to mention. One of the gentlemen said that despite all the things we're seeing on the global landscape, the state is still in control. It's the state, the nation state, that's still the fundamental unit, pushing things forward, pushing the agenda. And that is true up to a point, Lord Copper. That's an old Even on the War joke. It's true up to a point because you still see countries that are unable to fend off some of the things being imposed on them by global, supranational, multilateral organizations and by other actors, some of which I won't describe today. So I think there is a kind of push-pull, a kind of balance, if you will, between the nation state and all these other things that operate above and beyond the nation state. Now, I said balance, and therein lies the problem, because I think there might have been a balance at one point between these different power structures. But we're living in a world today where there is an imbalance, and increasingly, as I think most people in this room will agree, those structures and entities and agencies at the supranational level have more and more power than ever before. And while the nation state perdures, continues to survive, continues to exist, these other entities seem to have more power and increasingly seem to erode or absorb more power, or they attempt to take more power from the nation state. There's plenty of examples of this. But anyway, I just wanted to start off with that point because it really bothered me last night to hear that. It's true up to a point, but anyway. Now, my comments for the next 20, 30 minutes, I won't make you suffer beyond that, are based on several things. First of all, several decades as a journalist working internationally, and two, as a student of human beings. So no matter where I was, either as a journalist or sometimes working in communications and PR within the bosom of some of these multilateral international organizations, I've watched and listened and absorbed and tried to see what is the attitude, what is the mentality behind the people who work for these entities like the World Bank, entities like the UN or the IMF, etc. And so many of my comments are derived from my observations and direct personal experience with these organizations. I guess to sum it up, what I've seen is a tension between the attitude, the mentality, the worldview, the values of the people staffing the IMF or one of the many thousands of different international multilateral organizations that exist, and the very people that often are supposed to be the beneficiaries of their policies and programs. There's a very clear tension. There's almost a disdain on the part of the staffers of these organizations, a dismissive attitude towards the people who are the recipients of their largesse, to put it one way. My comments are also based on another aspect of my personality, or professional life rather, which is a lifelong student of conservatism. It was mentioned that I edit this journal. The journal is really a vehicle for me to study and learn about all the different center-right, extreme-right, reactionary, traditionalist, conservative movements in Europe and around the world, even Chile. I'm a big fan of several groups and thinkers in Chile. Jaime Guzman is actually one of the names you might know. And what, as other scholars have pointed out, and as I've learned, there is or has been always a kind of conservative internationale behind the scenes, operating primarily since the 1950s. This conservative internationale is manifested or exists in the form of different bodies, private associations that many of which, interestingly, were set up by Otto von Habsburg during the Cold War. Some scholars refer to these groups as transnational elite circles, and they operate kind of like a shadow government. And it sounds also conspiratorial, but it's not really. I mean, these are informal bodies that exist to advise governments and different leaders. And they have a very tangible influence on the decision-making process of a lot of these countries. Now, I mention this because over the years, what I've noticed is The ideology of these supposedly conservative transnational elite circles has shifted also. And while in the 50s and 60s and 70s, they had a very clear vision about fighting communism and defending the nation state, especially in the face of mass ideological movements, today, and this is based on recent gatherings and meetings and conferences that these groups have had, today they increasingly exhibit the same mentality as the political establishment in most of our countries. In other words, they've moved from having principles that were conservative and anti-ideological to today to a defense of the global order as it is. In other words, they're trying to preserve the status quo. And so I have begun to wonder whether these shadowy networks are conservative anymore, because from my point of view, they're doing the work of upholding the very system that is part of the problem. So let me just summarize before I get into a breakdown of what I'm going to of the global actors or entities, and then the national identity, however that's defined. Okay, this is my summary. There is a global cultural revolution. It's based on documentation. It's based on scholarship by very serious people, not the tin hat wearing crowd, but serious scholars who have looked at this. There is one person, for example, Marguerite Peters, a Belgian, who's written about this extensively. It's her life's mission to unfold, unpack, and explain how all these global entities are pushing an agenda, like the Agenda 2030. That's the most recent manifestation of this revolution. But there are many other scholars. I'm happy to share with you later. This revolution threatens many of the things that we cherish, that we love, that we want to defend. And what are those things? Well, we men and women of the West, broadly conceived, are inheritors of a tradition of values and principles and beliefs that comprise what we used to call the Judeo-Christian tradition, or the Judeo-Christian West, or simply Christendom, which wasn't just European, right? Because through the centuries, that tradition was carried out to the furthest reaches of the world, and we established civilization across the world. All that's under attack, as you know. It's under attack through ideological means, through educational systems and institutions, and through political movements. Now, this assault has taken many, many forms, operates on different levels. Like I said, education. There's also legal assaults, civil society, the NGOs of the world, and I'll get into a little bit more detail in a moment. Corporations. There's no one here, I think, doubts that corporations today are also part of this revolution or this agenda pushing. Just look at the icons during the month of June, the icons and the emoticons and the symbols that corporations suddenly start using in June. They're all the same, right? They're all rainbow. Why? It's hard to say which of all these different actors and mechanisms and processes are the worst. I think they're all bad. In this vast constellation of actors, it's hard to say this group, these multilaterals, or these NGOs have done the most damage. But it's, I think, without a doubt, they're all facilitating this revolt against tradition, local customs, local economies, everything that I think most of us want to defend. Okay, so I'm going to now talk about globalism. Big word. What does it mean? I don't know. There's many ways to interpret it. If you're guided by the books, and there are hundreds of books that have tried to set out a theory of globalization or a theory of globalism, it looks like a very innocuous process or thing. It's all about convergence and facilitating international trade and the harmonization of accounting standards, etc. Nothing to worry about. It's just going to make our lives much better. In fact, I had this intense argument with my 88-year-old father a few weeks ago about this. I told him, I'm going to be talking about globalism versus local identity or local traditions or national identity, rather. And he said, what? They go together, Mario. How can you argue for one or the other? And he said, look at you. You're a direct beneficiary of globalization and globalism. Look at what you're wearing, what you do, what you talk, etc. And he has a point, again, up to a point. But we're talking about an imbalance here. I mean, no one is really saying that it's better to be totally a globalist or totally a nationalist. There's a tension there. But the power, the balance is definitely shifting. So those kinds of arguments are kind of silly from my perspective. Yes, we're all beneficiaries of this globalism. But the globalism I have in mind is a very bad thing. At root, it is a set of attitudes, of beliefs. It's a disposition toward the world and towards your fellow man. At the bottom, it's an ideology, basically, that denies or minimizes human dignity, the individual human dignity of different people, and reduces all human beings to kind of inputs, economic inputs into economic processes, and sees all human beings as just tools or instruments that just need to be moved around, and you need to adjust this policy so that this flow of human beings can go there. Oh, and the German market needs more it's this manipulation. It's treating human beings as objects. It instrumentalizes people. It reduces them to instruments. When I began, I talked about observing people in the places I've worked and places I've been, and the attitude that most clearly comes through is hubris, arrogance. I've seen this, and I've heard the way people talk at different institutions. And not only do they seem to treat human beings or see human beings as instruments and tools, but there's also underlying all this, and I think this was mentioned yesterday, a kind of attempt to create a new kind of human being, a new man, a global man, a citizen of the world. Now, this is interesting, especially to me, because one of the things I have been fixated on for years is this idea of multicultural man and global citizen. Is that possible? Now, as a Bolivian, Italian, American, this kind of question obsesses me. Like, well, am I Italian? Am I Latin? What am I? And so this multicultural man sounds like a wonderful thing. Yes, one can be multicultural and a global citizen. Yet, you can't. There is no such thing. In the end, we are all rooted in something, in a particular tradition. I think it means nothing to say you're a citizen of the world. It doesn't compute. It's like when people say, well, I don't like John and Mark really annoys me, but I love humanity. What does that mean? I don't know how you can love humanity. You can only love individual human beings. It's an act of the will. Love is a very specific thing. It's a value response to a specific human being. So loving humanity, I don't understand it. If any one of you can explain it to me, I'm all ears. So this attempt to create or create a theory of multicultural man and global citizen is what underlies a lot of these institutions. It's part of that global ideology. It imbues the thinking and the attitudes of those people working in the hallways of the IMF and the World Bank. And I keep using the same examples, but I'll give you some others that you probably have never heard of. It's an attitude that fundamentally ridicules tradition, the local. It sees people with such values as kind of provincial. Oh, it's so quaint. Look at them there in rural, Italy. So lovely where they're dancing and they're singing, but they don't really know. We know better. It's that attitude. Yeah, it's incredible. I'm just thinking back and looking at some anecdotes I jotted down of some of the conversations I've been privy to. And it really is astonishing, the arrogance of these people. And keep in mind also, I don't know how many of you know this, most of these, if not all, of the multilaterals, the big ones, have incredibly comfortable job situations. In other words, tax-free salaries, extensive or generous subsidies for children. Every child, you get additional money, you get a housing subsidy. So a lot of the people who end up working at these, they never leave. Why would you? It's the best job in the world, and you're beholden to really basically no one. You just have to do the work of these bureaucracies. Anyway, enough about that. Let me get into national identity. So what about it? Somehow, it's a little bit easier to talk about, I think. I'm not going to get into the very interesting psychological explanations of how identity is constructed. You know, there's often the model of the concentric circles, different levels or spheres of identity. But we're talking about national identity, and let me just say a few things about that. That national identity, it's rooted in or based on a sense of belonging to a particular political community, to a kin, a clan, a tribe, to a cult. I mean, like the Catholic Church, that is a cult. Any church is a cult. Not in a bad way, because most of us are used to thinking of cults as bad, to be avoided. But cult is a very, very common human phenomenon. You develop a cult around something that you worship, that you cherish, that you embody. Anyway, identity is rooted in these things, this fidelity to something, fidelity to your people, to your community. It's a celebration of common things that you share with people around you. So that gives you the unity. National identity is based on these things, and it's linked to, of course, the nation state, to the political community, which is our fundamental home, to that unit that was described last night that drives many things. I don't want to enter into a discussion right now about how national identity is related to populism or nationalism, etc. But I just want to underscore the following, that it is distinct from the global mindset. It's distinct from globalism because it is rooted somewhere. National identity is rooted in a place, in a geography, in a terrain, in a terroir, if you're French. Some of you may have heard of David Goodhart, the British author who wrote a book exploring these ideas of somewheres, those people who are rooted in time and place, and then what he calls the anywheres. Who are those? Those are the people working for the global institutions who they can live in Bangkok, Geneva, New York, London, and it's all the same because they live in a bubble. And they've lost that allegiance to a country or to a place. The somewheres and the anywheres. David Goodhart. I'll give you these references at the end, too, if you'd like. This is probably my favorite part, is looking at the landscape and the actors that populate this landscape. The actors who are pushing this agenda, this global agenda. There are four broad categories, according to my typology. There are the supranational, multinational, multilateral, intergovernmental organizations that I've already mentioned. Then there's the private sector corporations that I alluded to earlier. And within them, the entertainment or media sector is particularly noxious. And then there's the transnational actors, the non-governmental organizations. And I'll say a few things about each. First, the supranational, multinational, intergovernmental organizations. Big words, right? They love these big words, but it's I can find no alternatives. It's amazing. Last summer, I took a look at all the different kinds of these organizations, and I'm just going to list the categories. I won't list the specific organizations, but let me just give you the categories of organizations that exist at this multilateral, international, supranational level. There are fisheries organizations. They handle fish. There's almost 20 of them internationally. There's agricultural research organizations, there are maritime organizations, obviously financial trade and customs organizations. There's cultural and ethnic and linguistic and religious organizations. There are obviously military alliances like AUKUS, NATO. There are educational organizations. I have a friend who works in Brussels for Education International, which is the international arm of the National Education Association in the United States. Tax-free salary, $180,000 euros per year, tax-free. And what does he do? He basically talks about how all education should reflect LGBT ideas. There are transport organizations, humanitarian organizations, environmental, arms control, energy, digital. And for each of these, there are at least 20 or 40 organizations. That's just the tip of the iceberg. What about the UN? Well, the UN has 6 principal organs. One of them is no longer active, the United Nations Trusteeship Council. I don't even know what they used to do. But within the UN monstrosity, there are still various funds and programs and specialized agencies: food and agriculture in Rome, International Labor Organization, civil aviation, etc., etc. I have a list of about 25 of those UN agencies. All of them have offices, of course, well-staffed, well-paid. And then there are subsidiary UN organs. I won't get into that, etc., etc. Why am I spending so many minutes on the UN? Well, it's because they're one of the worst transgressors in pushing this agenda. And it's not me saying that. Again, there has been serious scholarship done on this. The current Minister for Family in Italy, Family, Natality, and Equal Opportunities, Eugenia Maria Rocchella, co-wrote a book a few years ago about how the UN pushes an anti-Christian agenda, well documented. Sadly, it's only in Italian. It might be in Spanish too, not in English. But that's a very important work, one of several. So it's not just this random guy telling you that the UN's bad. It's been documented. The other group I mentioned was private sector corporations and their power. Yesterday, I think BlackRock was mentioned. They're part of this. What's interesting is that although, let's say, the current Russian geopolitical strategy and then America's emphasis, well, primarily under Trump for America first, and with China's global expansion, all that seems to vindicate that commentary from last night that the state is really in the driving seat. What's interesting is that after decades of globalization, it's multinationals like Apple and Starbucks and others that still wield phenomenal power. I mean, let's start with the non-financial services kind of corporations. There are companies like the ones I just mentioned and others in Walmart that oversee huge, massive supply chains. They sell products all over the world, and in the process, they help mold international politics to their interests. So I have a list of the 25 biggest, wealthiest companies combined with the wealthiest countries in the world. And of the 25, almost half are corporations. The first 7 are, well, the G7. But then you get Walmart, and then you have some company in China called State Grid, and then China National Petroleum. So it's very interesting. I mean, we're talking massive amounts of financial power. But never mind that. Let's talk about hedge funds and financial services and money management. BlackRock is the biggest, as we heard last night. $9 trillion under management. The top 7 include Vanguard Group, Fidelity Investments, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs. All American companies, but that really doesn't matter because these are global operators and they're staffed and their executive class are now just global citizens. But they have all of those have several trillion under management. Why do I mention this? It's because this matters. They do wield a lot of power, and not just power at the bank. I remember reading that when Fidelity Investments, the number 3 on my list, went to Spain for some meetings, the Minister of the Economy basically stumbled over himself trying to set up a meeting with them, while at the same time there was an official from the French government visiting. The priority was to meet with Fidelity, not the French government. I think that says something. The third grouping is, or within this, the subset was the entertainment industry and the global media. And I don't think I need to say much about them. They wield immense power. Look how effective CNN and CNBC and BBC have been in pushing the myth that Poland or Hungary is rapidly slipping into some kind of fascism. When I visit friends in the United States, they say, "Oh, you travel to Hungary? Isn't it dangerous? Aren't there like troops on the streets?" Like, no. They're getting this from the global media, which forms your reality more and more. And the global media, seemingly in collusion with some of these progressive powers, seem to target certain countries. Interestingly, those countries seem to be the most traditional in terms of values regarding their position on marriage or the family. That global media machine is something that actually merits its own separate presentation, because the way it works, the way it manipulates things is incredible. One of hundreds of examples I've collected over the years. New York Times recently reported on the global machine. That's their direct quotation. The global machine fueling anti-immigrant sentiment in Europe. And they argued that shady, well-funded networks of racists, that's all you have to say, right? Just say that word and it shuts down all conversation. They said that well-funded networks of racists were facilitating the creation of anti-immigration positions in Europe, and the dark money on the Christian right. They said that conservative Christian news portals were facilitating willingly the rise of extremism. That's just one of many examples. And then the third category, I think my favorite for many reasons, is the transnational sector, the NGOs, the third sector, civil society. But it also includes criminal networks. Now, transnational just means you're operating across borders, in and out, and not going through a state or a government. So this includes Mara Salvatrucha, MS-13, the Central American gang. That's a transnational network. I don't like it, but it operates like that. The Somali pirates, they're a transnational network. How is that? Well, because they create syndicates. Do you know how they finance their piracy ventures? Well, first they gather the villagers around. Everyone puts in some money. It's fascinating, and like pre-emerging finance here. And they create a syndicate. And so they gather the money, and then they have, let's say, 500,000 euros, dollars, whatever it is, to finance the venture. Then they get the boats. Then they do the piracy mission. They get the oil tanker. They get paid off, and you get the return on the investment. The villagers celebrate. But a lot of the money they also raise from neighboring countries. So they're operating as transnational networks. It's fascinating. But let me go into the NGO sector, the non-governmental organizations, those supposedly volunteer associations that are set up to achieve something, to do some good, to help some people, to achieve something. Goes charities and research institutes, churches, lobby groups, professional associations. There are currently, according to the Yearbook of International Organizations, 40,000 NGOs operating in the world. This is interesting because in a 2020 data set looking at international organizations and NGOs said that up until the year 2000, there had been an average of 500 intergovernmental organizations. How did we get from 500 to 40,000 in 20 years? It's incredible. I suspect the numbers are wrong, but if they're not, that terrifies me. That's massive growth. And of course, most of these NGOs are progressive, left of center. And increasingly, a lot of them seem to be carrying the rainbow flag. There's many other ways to organize this, to understand the entities and the actors that operate internationally. But for me, this works, these three kind of categories. So where are we? Globalism with the global actors and national identity and the things that we want to preserve or defend. There is an emerging struggle. I think there's no doubt about that. And actually, it's not just now. It's not just in the last 5, 10, 15, or even 20 years. This struggle, this tension, has been emerging for nearly a century, at least. It's not exactly a new phenomenon. I have a long list of books. Again, I'm happy to share them with you. But one of the earliest analyses of this situation, of the emergence of this new class of people operating globally, was in 1941, so 80 years ago, roughly, by James Burnham, The Managerial Revolution. Maybe you've heard of that. The Managerial Revolution, what is happening in the world? I'll come back to that. So that's one of the first serious attempts to explain what's been happening. I'm at 30 minutes, so I'll probably take another 5 or 10 with moderator's permission. Okay. Then in 1966 is another important book called Tragedy and Hope, written by a professor at Georgetown called Carol Quigley, who went on to mentor a young Bill Clinton. This is very interesting though it borders that line of conspiracy thinking. Now, Carroll Quigley was an esteemed professor, like I said, Georgetown, and he had some kind of epiphany or maybe a religious conversion, and he wrote this manuscript that eventually was published. And he claimed that there was indeed an Anglo-American secret society. This is like out of a movie, right? Led by Cecil Rhodes and Alfred Milner and others, that had significant influence over British and American foreign policy in the 20th century. And he used the files of the Council on Foreign Relations to write this book. It's incredible it even got published. It's out of print, of course. And then there's a book, several books written by former World Bank officials that basically say the same thing I've been saying, that these prestigious institutions with people from elite institutions like Oxford and Cambridge and Princeton are really in the business for themselves, but they pretend that they're helping the poor around the world. In fact, one of the books is called The Lords of Poverty, the power, prestige, and corruption of the international aid business. I mean, and it goes on and on. But what all these books do is talk about the emergence of an overclass, as Charles Murray says, or a ruling class, as Angelo Codevilla says. Or John Fonte, also a scholar at Hudson Institute, talks about sovereignty or submission, because he's talking about that same tension. Do we submit to these international organizations and their agenda, or do we reassert national identity and sovereignty? Do we protect our nation state? It's fascinating. So I said I'd come back to Burnham very quickly. Burnham, in 1941, in the managerial revolution, basically looked at the world as it was then and said, okay, you have Nazi Germany, you have Stalinist Russia, and you have America just after the New Deal under Roosevelt. And he said, well, what he said was that he noticed that a similar class of manager was emerging in all places. He called them managers, who were trying to achieve dominance over the rest of their societies, whether it was Germany or Russia or the United States. And he said, you know, the demarcation between ruling elites and the mass of society is no longer about ownership. That's kind of passé. He said the real thing is who controls the means of production, which is different from ownership. It's like who is controlling the levers of power. And so this new class, these managers were emerging. And this is the class or the grouping of people that Charles Murray later calls the overclass, those who kind of run things. All right. There's a lot more I could say about the origins of this kind of mentality. I mean, we could go back to the progressive era in the 1920s, which is a fascinating period when a lot of this starts also getting developed, where people start saying, wait, I have a degree from Harvard. I know more than other people. I'm smarter, so I should be leading others and telling people how to live. I think that mentality permeates a lot of the institutions today. What does all this mean for Croatia and Croatians? Well, I think for the moment you seem to be somewhat inoculated from this, but believe me, it's coming. All this stuff is spreading and accelerating. And I don't know what the response is. And as a conservative, my challenge is, well, is there anything we can do or I can do to resist this stuff? Or do I just step aside and watch it all happen? Or, more troublingly, I've heard this from some, do you facilitate it so that something new may arise? That is a very scary option. You don't want to facilitate this stuff. You don't want to facilitate this or create a crisis situation, because more than anything, I think instability would be very dangerous for most of us. I think I'll end there. I'm happy to make other comments later. Thank you for your attention.